Day after day, we are surrounded by the presence of criminals. We are spectators to the deepest darkness in human actions and the bizarre reality that someone's suffering can be a form of pleasure. As dedicated investigators of the criminal world, we're on a mission to uncover the most shocking crimes and get inside the minds of those who commit them. I am Luke, and today I bring you another unreal true crime. The story of the House of Horrors. In January 2018, one of the daughters of the Turpin couple, Jordan Turpin, escaped from her home. She jumped out of a window, and once outside, she called emergency services. At the time, the young girl, named Jordan, was 17 years old. What she told the operator was hard to believe, not only for the operator, but also for the police who later responded to the call.
911 emergency, what are you reporting?
Help.
This is 911, do you have an emergency?
I just got away from home because I live in a family of 15, okay? Can you hear me? And we have abusing parents. Did you hear that?
Okay, how did they abuse you?
Okay. They hit us, they throw us across, they like throw us across the room. They pull our hair, they yank out our hair. I have my two little sisters right now are chained up.
The call lasted about 20 minutes. During this time, Jordan informed the operator about the violence and abuse she and her siblings had endured. She explained that there were 15 family members living in one house, 13 siblings and their two parents. She described how some of her siblings were chained, tied to their beds with chains that prevented them from bathing or eating, and they lived in filth. She detailed various kinds of physical and psychological abuse they suffered. While the operator was speaking with her, they contacted the police so they could head to the location where Jordan was waiting. When the police finally arrived where the young girl was waiting, the first thing they noticed was that she didn't look 17 years old, but much younger. Her voice also didn't match the age she claimed. It sounded like that of a child. She was quite disheveled and dirty. When trying to explain why she called and why she wanted them to come, her speech was not very coherent and was quite slow. The police initially thought she might have some disorder due to her appearance and manner of speaking. However, Jordan then showed them several photos on the same cell phone she used to call the operator. These photos showed the conditions inside her house, including her siblings chained to their beds. The police, without wasting more time, headed to the address Jordan provided. Upon arrival, they were immediately struck by the strong smell of urine and human waste. The house was littered with garbage bags in every room, including the living room and kitchen. In the children's room, they discovered 12 children, ranging from 3 to 29 years old, as Jordan had already escaped. Shockingly, one of them was found chained to their bed. The police quickly realized they were dealing with a severe case of child abuse, far more profound and complex than they could have imagined, with some children having lived in these horrid conditions for decades. These children were the children of David and Louise Turpin, who had grown up in the small town of Princeton, Virginia. There, Louise, originally named Louise Robinet, lived with her parents and two younger sisters, Elizabeth and Teresa, in a humble low-income household. Despite their quiet and shy demeanor, especially in front of their parents, the siblings were quite close. Louise, the eldest, behaved differently outside her home, often rebellious and using foul language. Raised in a Pentecostal family deeply involved in church activities, the girls were expected to adhere to strict behavioral standards, reflecting the religious values their father, a pastor, taught. They were prohibited from activities typical for other children, such as speaking ill, disobeying, or dressing in certain ways. More was expected from them, being the pastor's daughters. David, who lived about 9 kilometers away from Louise's home, was also deeply involved in the church. The families of David and Louise were close primarily because of their shared commitment to their faith. Louise and David had known each other since childhood, and their characters were largely defined by their religious involvement. Despite the affectionate relationship between the two families, Louise's father disapproved of her relationship with David, considering her too young for any romantic involvement. Contrarily, Louise's mother supported the relationship, even helping her daughter secretly meet David. David, perceived as a decent young man, was polite and dressed unusually for his age, often seen in suits and ties. He was active in school clubs, abstained from alcohol, and was notably introverted. After high school, he pursued a degree in computer engineering and graduated with high marks. David and Louise's relationship, kept secret due to her father's disapproval, was marked by their strong desire to be together. Realizing they could not continue under such circumstances, they decided to elope, setting in motion a series of events that would culminate in the discovery of the House of Horrors. One day, while Louise was in a high school class, David executed a daring plan. He disguised himself to appear older, donning a fake mustache, a hat, and a suit, and entered the high school. He successfully convinced the supervisor in charge of student welfare that he was a relative of Louise and managed to take her with him. Together, they left the school and embarked on a journey to Texas, ultimately arriving in Fort Worth. Their intention was to begin a new chapter of their lives together in this new location. However, their parents were obviously worried and angry about their disappearance. Particularly concerning was the issue of public perception, as it looked bad for a pastor's daughter to run off with someone without being married first. Louise's parents reported her disappearance to the police. 3 days later, the couple was found in Texas. Louise was brought back to her home because she was a minor. Upon their return, Louise's father somewhat acquiesced. He told them that if they truly wanted to be together, they must do so in accordance with their religious beliefs. This meant they had to get married, as sleeping in the same bed or engaging in sexual relations without being married was considered a sin in their family. Being deeply in love, they agreed to follow her father's instructions. In 1985, when Louise was just 16 years old, they got married in a small ceremony. They continued to live in Virginia for a couple more years. 3 years after their wedding, in 1988, they welcomed their first child, a girl. They stayed in Virginia with their daughter for another 2 years, until the early 1990s. It was then they decided it was time for a change, to grow and move on. They chose to leave Virginia for Fort Worth, Texas, the place they had initially escaped to 5 years earlier. Their decision to move was motivated by 2 main reasons. David wanted to relocate because he had been offered a very good, well-paying job in Texas, which he did not want to turn down. And Louise, as she told her sisters, wanted to leave Virginia, primarily to distance herself from her family. She no longer wished to have direct contact with her family, at least not at that time. And this was because, according to what the sisters said, their maternal grandfather had been abusing their mother since their mother was a child, and this abuse only stopped once their mother got married. Then her mother had her 3 daughters, so the grandfather started abusing the girls also since they were very young. Since Louise was the oldest daughter, she had suffered this abuse for many more years. The moment Louise escaped to Texas with David when he was 16 years old, the abuse stopped. Her sister even says that on one occasion when Louis was between 14 or 15 years old, her grandmother came into the house and saw that her husband was abusing her granddaughter. But the only thing she could think of to do was to gather the 3 sisters and also several members of the family who knew that this abuse was happening, and she told them not to say anything, because the family had a reputation to keep. This situation started because the grandfather had a lot of money, and the three girls were quite poor and lived in quite humble conditions, so the grandfather gave them money. The mother took the girls to the grandfather's house, and they always cried and asked her not to take them because they knew what was going to happen when they went to see this man. However, their mother told them she needed the money to buy food, shoes, and clothing, so she felt compelled to take them. She was also aware of what was happening, as she herself had been subjected to the same abuse by her father since she was a child. Louise's younger sister, Teresa, mentioned that their grandfather would place money in their hands while abusing them, then close their hands around it. This was his way of trying to compensate for his actions, at least in his mind. After giving them money, he would tell them not to cry because he had given them money, implying they had no reason to cry according to him. Once he finished, he would take them outside to the door or to the car where their mother was waiting, and they would see him giving money to their mother. Louise harbored deep resentment towards her family because many of them knew about the abuse but said nothing due to the grandfather's wealth. After Louise escaped to Texas, her two sisters who remained still suffered abuse from their grandfather for many more years. Once in Texas, Louise and David bought a house in a nice neighborhood. David was doing well financially, so they never had money problems. They often visited their families in Virginia. Initially, it was just Louise, David, and their daughter. A few years later, in 1992, they had their second child, a boy. Now they had a 4-year-old daughter and a newborn son. Louise's family thought that all her childhood suffering was somehow being compensated for with the family she was now building. She had a husband she claimed to love dearly, a daughter and a son, a nice house, money, and good cars. Her life seemed ideal in the eyes of her family in Virginia. Even David's family saw them as very generous with their money, not seeming to mind giving their family whatever they needed. When they couldn't visit Virginia, they paid for their families to visit them in Texas, covering flight, food, and all expenses. They even took them to Disneyland and Universal Studios and gave them cash if needed. Between 1992, when their second child was born, and 1996, they had 4 more children, totaling 6. Over the years, visits with their families decreased. What neither David's nor Louise's family knew was that in 1992, they had to declare bankruptcy. They were spending far more than what David, the sole earner, was making. Louise stayed home to care for the children. They had significant debts with various banks and credit card debts. Despite this, they continued having children. From 1994 to 1996, Louise and David believed in the idea that they should not stop having children until God willed it. They had always wanted a large family, which they were achieving. Their eldest daughter was the only one attending primary school at that time because of her age. However, she faced significant bullying at school due to her thin appearance and often being dirty or smelly. One of her classmates recalls an incident where the girl had a chocolate wrapper tied in her hair, which led to further mockery. Consequently, her parents decided to withdraw her from school and homeschool her. All subsequent children were homeschooled as well. By 1999, they had 7 children, and Louise's in-person contact with her family had become almost non-existent. The last time they were seen was in 1998. After that, there were only sporadic phone calls, which also diminished over time. The family was deeply in debt and couldn't afford their house payments, leading the bank to repossess the house. The new owner, upon entering, found a distressing scene: feces on the walls, urine smell throughout the house, and scratches on the doors. Initially, he thought they might have had untrained pets, but never imagined that children were responsible for the damage. He took photos of the scene, which he kept for 20 years. In 2018, when the children's mistreatment was discovered, he provided these photos to the press. The family then moved to Rio Vista, Texas, a rural area with widely spaced homes. The property they moved to was large, about 15 acres, so their neighbors were not close. In Fort Worth, the children were not allowed outside, but in Rio Vista, it initially seemed like things would change. The children were allowed to play in the yard and even interact with a neighbor's daughter, though she never entered their house. The neighbor's daughter recalls them always playing together, engaging in typical children's activities. However, when the neighbor's mother tried to get to know the children, they responded strangely. Some were silent, others seemed fearful. She noticed their hands were very clean compared to the rest of their dirt-covered bodies, as if they had been playing in the dirt all day. One child commented that they were only allowed to wash their hands up to their wrists to conserve water. The neighbor thought this was odd, but didn't give it much importance, considering their overall appearance and behavior unusual. After the neighbors started asking questions, she noticed the children were no longer allowed outside as frequently. Her daughter tried to visit them multiple times, but Louise eventually told her she could no longer play with her children or enter their property. Despite the girl's attempts to understand why, the door was never opened to her again. The neighbor recalls that in the window of that house, there was always a baby in a crib, and when she returned hours later, the baby was still there, crying continuously. It seemed as though no one had attended to or moved the baby for hours. This is when the neighbors started to notice that the children were no longer seen outside during the day. Despite the presence of many children in the house, there was complete silence throughout the day. However, at night, all the lights in the house would turn on, and sounds of the children could be heard from inside. Occasionally, the children were seen playing in the yard, but only during the night hours. 11 years after moving to that house in Rio Vista, in 2010, their eldest daughter escaped. She managed to run about 5 kilometers until she reached a dirt road, where she encountered a woman driving a truck. The woman stopped to see what was wrong with the girl, who appeared very agitated. She noticed that the girl was very thin, dirty, and struggled to speak clearly. The woman asked the girl several questions to gauge her awareness of time and space, like who the president was or the current year, but the girl had no knowledge of these things. Thinking the girl might have a mental condition, the woman convinced her to give her address so she could return her to her parents' house. During the ride, the girl kept asking how she could get a job, an apartment, and a car, reinforcing the woman's belief that she had some issues. The woman took her home, left her with her parents, and never reported the incident to the police. The girl had tried to escape because the situation in the Turpin house was horrible. In 2007, the Turpin parents had moved 10 of their children into an isolated trailer on their property. David and Louise took the 2 youngest and left the rest of the children to fend for themselves, bringing groceries on a weekly basis but not enough to feed everybody. One of their daughters, Jordan Turpin, aged 6 years at the time, stated there was a lot of starving, and she had resorted to eating ketchup or mustard or ice. The kids were often shackled, strangled, and beaten for infractions such as playing in water by washing their hands above the wrists. They were also frequently left to lie in their own waste, unable to use a toilet while chained, and were allowed only 1 shower per year. Deprived of food, they were taunted by their parents with apple and pumpkin pies they could see and smell, but never eat, and brand new toys in unopened packages scattered around the putrid home. Then, in 2010, David lost his job again, forcing them to leave the house overnight as the bank repossessed it. The neighbors didn't realize they had left until they saw a sign from the bank announcing the house was for sale. Out of curiosity, As they had never entered the house in 11 years, several neighbors went inside. They found 2 dogs eating from the trash left behind. The house was filled with garbage, including children's chairs, beds, and mattresses covered in excrement and urine. Despite seeing all this and realizing the family lived in filth, nobody reported it to the police, including the bank or the new owner. This could have been a significant alert, as children should not live in such conditions. But no one took action. The family decided to move to California after leaving Rio Vista, Texas. There is no specific information about why they chose California, as they had no family there and, as far as is known, no outstanding job offers that would have motivated the move. When they arrived in California, they lived in 2 houses that were quite close to each other. Unlike the large property in Rio Vista, it would seem difficult to keep so many children quiet in a neighborhood where houses were close together. They initially arrived in Rio Vista with 7 children, but when they moved to California, they had 12 children plus the 2 parents, making it a total of 14 people in one house. Despite this, they managed to remain unnoticed for 4 years in the first house before moving to another house in Paris, California, where they lived for another 4 years. On January 14, 2018, before 6 a.m., 2 of the sisters, aged 13 and 17, decided to escape the house to seek help for their siblings. The 13-year-old got scared and returned home, but the 17-year-old, Jordan, continued with the plan she and her siblings had been working on for over 2 years. Jordan managed to take a cell phone from the house, which did not have service but could call emergency services. She called 911, and during the approximately 20-minute call, she described the abuse they suffered, mostly at the hands of their mother, and sometimes by their father. When the police arrived, Jordan showed them the cell phone with photos of their living conditions. The police knocked on the door, and Louise allowed them to enter voluntarily, seemingly unaware of any wrongdoing. Inside, the police found the house in terrible condition, with trash, urine, and feces everywhere. The living conditions for the children were appalling. Louise followed the officers around the house, questioning why they were there and why they needed to see her children, not understanding the seriousness of the situation. In one of the rooms, the police found one child chained to the bed and observed marks on the ankles of 2 other children, indicating they had recently been unchained. It's unclear if the parents had realized that their daughter had escaped and unchained the children as a result. The police immediately arrested the parents and took them to a patrol car. After that, they began taking the children out of the house and transported them to a local hospital for evaluation, as many of them urgently needed medical care due to severe malnourishment. Once the news of what was happening spread, the street filled up with neighbors and media, and this became one of those stories that get extensively covered. Neighbors, media, and information presented by the California City prosecutor in the following days revealed the extent of the children's suffering, not only in that house but also since their time in Texas. In their first house in Fort Worth, Texas, the maltreatment of the children began gradually. For some reason, all their children were named with names starting with the letter J, although the reason was never explained. As the parents had more children, they began to isolate themselves and their children completely from their families. Their daughter, who initially attended primary school and was then homeschooled due to bullying, was one of the first to experience this isolation. Once they began homeschooling all their children, their control over them was absolute. The children were not allowed to go anywhere, had no friends other than their siblings, were only allowed to take a bath once a year, and were fed only once a day, leading to their underdeveloped appearance. Punishments included beatings, strangulation, or being tied to their beds. When tied to their beds, they could remain there for weeks or months, not even being released to use the bathroom. This explains the excrement and urine smell found in the house in Fort Worth after they left. The scratches on the doors, initially thought to be made by pets, were actually made by the children in their attempts to escape. When the family moved to their house in Rio Vista, the abuse that had begun in Fort Worth continued. The only change occurred when the neighbors started asking questions, which led the family to change their routine completely. They began living nocturnally, sleeping from the early morning hours until the evening, and only being active at night. This is why the neighbors never saw them during the day and heard no noise from the house as their classes, playtime, and other activities happened at night. After moving to California, for reasons not entirely known, they stopped using ropes to tie the children to the beds and began using chains and padlocks instead. This change was made after one of the children managed to escape from the ropes. It was also discovered that the children were not allowed to play with any toys, even though there were many in the house, all unopened in their original packaging. The parents would put different types of apple pies on the kitchen counter, letting the children see and smell them but not eat them. The pies were only for the parents. Feeding the children only once a day severely affected their physical and mental development. The eldest daughter, who was 29 years old, weighed only 82 pounds. The 12-year-old son appeared to be only 7 years old, and all the other siblings also looked younger than their actual ages. They spoke very slowly, and some had more difficulty than others in organizing their thoughts. This nocturnal lifestyle continued in California, making it harder for neighbors to notice anything unusual. After moving to their second house in California in 2014, some changes occurred. In 2014, they had their last child, their 13th, and according to the city prosecutor's report, this child was well fed and well kept, unlike the others. The parents took this baby to parks, constantly took photos, and sent them to relatives, explaining the absence of photos of the other 12 children by saying they were too restless. The parents maintained control over what their children said and did, using it as a way to prevent their family from finding out what was happening inside their home. The only photos available were the ones the mother posted on a family Facebook page, where the children were often dressed alike and in larger clothes to hide their thinness. Both parents were obsessed with Disneyland, and their car plates even featured Disneyland themes. They occasionally took their children to Disneyland or other outings, but these were rare and strictly controlled. The oldest son was the only child who had more contact with the outside world, as he was allowed to take a class at a local college. One of his classmates noted that he would eat incessantly whenever there was food in the classroom, as if he hadn't eaten in days. His 12 siblings rarely left the house except for some nighttime activities or special occasions like renewing their parents' vows in Las Vegas, done twice in the same chapel with an Elvis Presley impersonator. Videos of these events are available on YouTube, showing the children looking thin but smiling, which did not necessarily mean they were happy. As we watch these videos of the Turpin wedding in Las Vegas, we're given a rare glimpse into a very private aspect of their lives. Here, we see David and Louise Turpin renewing their vows in a ceremony that, on the surface, appears joyful and celebratory. The setting is classic Vegas. A small chapel, complete with an Elvis Presley impersonator officiating the ceremony. The couple seems to be embracing the moment, surrounded by their children who are dressed for the occasion. It's a surreal contrast to the grim reality of their home life that was hidden from the world. These videos capture moments of apparent happiness and normalcy, starkly juxtaposed against the backdrop of the harrowing conditions we now know the children were enduring. It's a poignant reminder of the complexities and contradictions that can exist behind closed doors. For 2 years, all the children planned and sought ways to alert someone for help. Finally, the 17-year-old daughter decided to escape and seek assistance. She knew that their way of living was somehow not within normal parameters. It wasn't right, despite being the only life she had known since birth. She understood that what was happening in her home was not normal. For many of us, stepping out of our house door is a mundane act, not even warranting a second thought. But for this 17-year-old girl, leaving her home alone for the first time, especially in the early morning darkness, and speaking with a stranger about her life was a significant and frightening step. She had no concept of what a police officer was, so when officers approached her, she did not run away but stayed and spoke with them, not knowing if she was safe or not. David and Louise pleaded not guilty to all the charges against them, which together amounted to more than 75 counts, including torture, child abuse, and neglect among many others. They were each given a bail of $12 million, equivalent to $1 million for each of their children, except for their youngest 3-year-old daughter, who they seemingly took good care of. Hence, no charges were brought for her mistreatment. Their plea of innocence meant that some of their children might have had to testify in court. To spare their children this ordeal, they eventually pleaded guilty to all charges. Louise claimed to have been diagnosed with a mental disorder and requested time for treatment before trial, hoping to be freed from charges after about 2 years. However, the court denied this request, citing insufficient evidence that her mental condition led to her actions towards her children. During their trial, 2 of their children presented letters they had written, which were read to their parents. Eventually, they were sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 25 years. At the time of the trial's conclusion, they were not allowed any contact with their children, although the judge mentioned that this might change in the future, depending on the children's wishes. The children's adaptation to a normal day schedule was challenging, as they were used to sleeping during the day and being active at night. On March 19, 2018, about 2 months after they were hospitalized, all 7 adult children, aged between 18 and 29, were discharged and placed in an adapted house with separate living spaces to start adapting to independent adult life. The 6 youngest were placed in foster homes for potential adoption, and it was known until 2018 that Louise's siblings wished to adopt all of them, maintaining only telephone contact at that time. It was discovered, rather strangely, that Jordan, the daughter who called 911 and escaped through the window, had started uploading videos to YouTube in late 2017, a few months before her escape. In these videos, she sang songs she composed herself. She also opened an Instagram account, posting several photos where only her face was visible inside her house. All this was done while still living with her parents, and it was unclear how she managed to access the internet and learn to use it without her parents' knowledge. When the police arrived, she didn't know what a police officer was, and she was also unfamiliar with the concept of medication, raising questions about how she knew to use YouTube and Instagram. Neighbors and relatives were questioned as to why they didn't notice or say anything, and why the children didn't seek help during their outings to Disneyland or Las Vegas. A psychologist suggested that the children's social and emotional skills might have developed differently due to incorrect feeding and being confined all day. This might have made them perceive their situation as normal or not inherently wrong. It was challenging for neighbors to detect such abuse, especially without a reference point or the imagination that something like this could happen next door. Teresa, Louise's youngest sister, stated she would never forgive Louise and didn't want anything to do with her, despite also being a victim of their maternal grandfather. Teresa maintained that she had never harmed her own children, who were well fed and cared for. She couldn't understand or justify Louise's actions based on their shared traumatic childhood. When the children were removed from the house, hundreds of diaries written by them were found, one of the few outlets they had to express themselves. However, the details in these diaries were not made public, nor were the explicit photos presented during the trial, out of respect for the children and to avoid media sensationalism. The aim was to allow the children to have as normal a life as possible, without media pursuit or further invasion of privacy. Life after the sentencing proved difficult for the victims. Some of the Turpin children who ended up in foster homes faced further abuse. It was reported in October 2019 that 5 of the younger children were adopted by an abusive family who further tormented them. Allegations included hitting them in the face with sandals, pulling their hair, hitting them with a belt, and striking their heads. They were forced to eat excessively and then forced to eat their own vomit, and the foster father was accused of grabbing and fondling them and kissing them on the mouth. The foster family was arrested and charged with abusing multiple children in their care. Several of the older ones have shown signs of instability due to post-traumatic stress. An investigation for the ABC News magazine reported that some of the Turpin children are now neglected by Riverside County Social Services. Some are homeless, and none are authorized to use the hundreds of thousands of dollars donated to them. Jordan, the catalyst for their liberation, and clearly the most initiative-driven, opened a TikTok account to receive donations to support her siblings. She declares herself a fighter and says that since her release, she has been navigating life like a rocket, trying to make up for lost time. Despite the seeming unending trials, the attitude of most of the children is positive and cheerful. They are still adapting to freedom and what the world has to offer anew. They are working on their education, health, and learning basic life skills. Some have even chosen to change their names, hoping it will help them start afresh. As the details of their ordeal continue to emerge, the haunting question remains unanswered. Why? What could lead two people, who seemingly started their relationship under the tenets of faith, to commit such inhumane and senseless acts? Before receiving his sentence, David Turpin said, "I never intended any harm to my children. I wish the best for them in the future." Both he and Louise repeatedly claimed they believed they were doing what was best, that they loved their children, and thought their children loved them too. And that's the end of today's case. As always, I appreciate your support for my work. If you subscribe, like, and share this video, it will help me continue creating content. This was another episode of Unreal True Crime. See you soon. Day after day, we are surrounded by the presence of criminals. We are spectators to the deepest darkness in human actions, and the bizarre reality that someone's suffering can be a form of pleasure. As dedicated investigators of the criminal world, we're on a mission to uncover the most shocking crimes and get inside the minds of those who commit them. I am Luke, and today I bring you another Unreal True Crime. The horrible James Bulger case. The horrible James Bulger case. On February 12, 1993, a Friday afternoon in Bootle, England, specifically at the New Strand Shopping Centre, Denise was with a friend and her son, James Bulger. James had recently stopped using a stroller, as he was 2 years and 10 months old, so he was walking alongside his mother. At around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Denise's friend took a different path, leaving Denise alone with her little James. At one point, Denise went to a store with her son, bought what she needed, and when she realized it, she saw that James was not with her. It was only a momentary distraction for a few seconds as she checked her purse, but this oversight would change their lives forever. We all have memories of getting separated from family members in a shopping center as children, so the response here was quite common. When Denise left the store, she reunited with her friend, who had just passed by the front of the shop, but she didn't see James anywhere. They assumed he had wandered off, so they began asking the mall security guards and anyone they encountered if they had seen the child. Soon, announcements were made over the mall speakers, inquiring about James, and as desperation mounted, several police patrols combed the area until nightfall, yet there was still no sign of James. The next step for the police was to review the shopping center's security cameras, as it was their only hope of discovering what had happened that afternoon with James. It was 1993, and security cameras had limited resolution at that time, and this particular shopping center didn't have many of them. However, one camera happened to be pointed at the store. The footage showed James leaving through the door, and Denny's lapse in attention was indeed brief, as within a minute she could be seen searching for James at the door, but by then it was already too late. The next trace of James was captured by one of the overhead cameras, showing him following two individuals. What was unusual was that these two individuals appeared to be teenagers, seemingly between the ages of 14 and 18. In the final image of James, he was seen leaving the shopping center with one of these boys holding his hand. Initially, there was hope, with the court thinking that these young boys wouldn't be capable of harming little James. However, 2 days later, the truth would come to light. More than 4 kilometers away from the shopping center, while playing, some teenagers stumbled upon the remains of a child on the train tracks, who had apparently been struck by a train. This discovery immediately set off alarms, and they contacted one of James' uncles, who unmistakably identified the child as James Bulger. It was clear that this was no accident. In fact, all evidence suggested that James had died before being struck by the train. His body bore so many injuries that investigators couldn't determine the exact cause of his death. There were 2 more unsettling details. He had a pair of batteries in his mouth, and his left eye had been eerily painted blue. It was as if his young body had been subjected to inhumane experimentation, and the crime scene would remain etched in the memory of all the officers present as one of the most horrifying scenes they had ever encountered in their careers. The local community was in shock and outrage over the tragic incident. Many expressed their heartfelt condolences to the family, particularly Denise. While she had a momentary lapse of attention, it was a mistake anyone could make, and those with empathy could understand the immense pain she was going through. She replayed in her mind daily the haunting thought that she might have saved her son had she been more vigilant at that moment. In addition to the sympathy, there were some individuals, including her own husband at one point, who angrily confronted her and blamed her for not being attentive enough, asserting that the tragedy could have been prevented with more careful supervision. The potential key to identifying the culprit lay in the shopping center's security cameras, but their image quality was so poor that even determining the suspects' ages was impossible. Various media outlets attempted to enhance the images in hopes of identifying the individuals, but their efforts proved fruitless. The last glimmer of hope rested on someone coming forward to confess to the crime. On February 16, just 2 days after James' body was discovered, the police received a crucial call. The caller accused a 12-year-old boy named Jonathan Green of being the perpetrator, and shockingly, this accusation came from his own parents. They claimed that their son bore a resemblance to one of the suspects captured in the security camera footage, a grave accusation indeed when it comes from one's own parents. Law enforcement took this accusation seriously and subjected Jonathan to nearly 23 hours of relentless interrogation before eventually declaring him innocent. In a subsequent interview, Jonathan revealed the profound psychological trauma he endured during this time, spending countless sleepless nights. The intensity of the questioning even tempted him to falsely admit guilt at one point. The parents, however, did not hesitate much before making the accusation, even though the images they based it on were captured just days earlier. Furthermore, Jonathan was a mere 12 years old, and giving him the benefit of the doubt should have been a priority. The only evidence against him was a vague resemblance, which wasn't particularly strong given the poor image quality, akin to images taken through a blender. The media, driven by the pursuit of attention, without much consideration, broadcasted Jonathan as the prime suspect. This prompted people, fueled by a thirst for justice, to attack the vehicle in which he traveled with his parents and to vandalize their home by pelting it with stones until all the windows were shattered. The harassment was so severe that the Greens had to abandon their home and relocate to another city. Just 6 days after James' disappearance, a television program showed all available information about the case up to that date, hoping that a viewer might provide a clue to apprehend the culprits. The program was immensely popular at the time, and following its broadcast, the police received several calls, with one call standing out as particularly valuable. It came from a woman who firmly believed that the real culprits were Robert Thompson and John Venables. These boys were known for their mischievous behavior, which had escalated into criminal activities such as theft. They had gained a notorious reputation at their schools and were frequent truants. However, a significant conflict arose when the police suspected that the culprits were at least 14 years old, while these potential suspects were just 10 years old. Due to this discrepancy and the fact that there were several other suspects of similar age, the police decided to pay a visit to the homes of these young boys, although their expectations were not high. Initially, they observed some peculiar behavior, but it was challenging to draw definitive conclusions from these observations since the police had very little experience dealing with child offenders of this age. Subsequently, it was confirmed that both boys had skipped school on that particular day. Additionally, there was a noticeable detail. One of John's shoes displayed clear stains of blue paint. This piece of evidence led the authorities to consider them as prime suspects, and they were promptly taken to the police station. Unlike the previous case with Jonathan, this time the authorities handled it discreetly to prevent the young boys from enduring the extensive hours of questioning in a single session. Consequently, the interrogations were spread out over multiple days. The initial day of questioning proved to be challenging, given the boys' age of just 10, and the authorities couldn't subject them to the same scrutiny as adults. As a result, both boys steadfastly denied any involvement in the crime, and their age and emotional state played a significant role in this response. However, as the interrogations continued into the second day, a marked contrast emerged between Robert and John. Robert remained composed, displaying little emotion, not shedding a tear, and maintaining a stoic demeanor. On the other hand, John's emotional resilience began to waver, and he eventually confessed to the crime. John revealed that on that fateful afternoon, he and Robert had decided to skip school as they often did and ventured to the shopping center. Their initial actions upon arrival included stealing various items, among them a pair of batteries and a can of blue paint. Growing weary of their theft spree, a sinister idea took hold in their young minds. The idea of kidnapping a child. They planned to take the child onto the street and push them in front of an oncoming car. To execute this plan, they first signaled to another child to approach them. Fortunately, the child's vigilant mother intervened in time, preventing any harm. Continuing with their disturbing plan, as they passed by a butcher shop, they signaled to James Bulger through the window. Tragically, James responded to their call and left the shop, unbeknownst to his mother. The two boys quickly whisked James away from the shopping center to carry out their dark scheme. However, James, with his remarkable balance, made it challenging for them to push him far enough onto the road for a car to strike him. Undeterred, they decided to take James to a nearby canal, intending to push him in and drown him. Upon reaching the canal, they pushed him from above, but instead of falling into the water, James tumbled and struck his forehead, resulting in a visible bump. His cries for help filled the air. It is estimated that approximately 38 individuals witnessed these two boys with James, and a few inquired about their actions. Initially, one of the boys falsely claimed that they were brothers, which caused frustration among those who witnessed the incident. It is important to note that the onlookers faced a challenging situation involving children who appeared innocent, making intervention at the time more complex. However, what remains alarming and subject to criticism is the false explanation provided by John and Robert to one individual, stating that James was a lost child, and they were taking him to a police station. At that point, an adult had to be held accountable, because this tragic incident could have been prevented. It's clearly irresponsible to entrust the care of a lost child to two 10-year-olds. After walking for more than 4 kilometers, the boys took James to a remote railway track, devoid of any witnesses, and carried out unspeakable acts that are too gruesome to detail. They utilized whatever items they could find, including bricks, stones, and even a hefty 10-kilogram metal bar, inflicting unimaginable suffering upon James. When he lay lifeless, their intentions were unclear, whether to stage it as an accident or to inflict further harm on this young life. They left his lifeless body on the railway track, concealed beneath debris, to remain unnoticed until a passing train. Even the police found it difficult to comprehend such a horrifying reality, and they believed that there must have been prior signs or indicators. Consequently, they decided to delve into the backgrounds of these two young boys. As the police investigation continued, it became evident that both boys had experienced remarkably similar childhoods. Robert Thompson resided in a dysfunctional household where he and his 6 siblings suffered constant abuse from their father. His mother grappled with severe alcohol-related issues and had once attempted suicide while setting their home on fire. Robert had earned a reputation as a thief, displaying violent tendencies and compulsive lying. John Venables, on the other hand, came from a fractured family where his parents were divorced, and he received minimal attention and affection. Coupled with his short temper, John often engaged in mischief and fights to garner attention, eventually leading to his expulsion from school. It's widely believed that Robert took on the role of the ringleader during their terrible actions. Throughout the interrogations, both boys attempted to shift blame onto each other. Robert, displaying a shrewd demeanor, would acknowledge his presence but claim that he left when he saw John beginning to torment James on the railway tracks. When confronted with questions that cornered him, he would feign tears without shedding a single drop. However, the presence of blood and strands of James' hair on his clothing, particularly his shoes, served as irrefutable evidence of his involvement. Consequently, on February 20, both were declared guilty, identified only as Boy A and Boy B to circumvent potential issues similar to those faced by Jonathan Green. It was known only that they were two 10-year-old boys residing in Walton. This case was a recipe for turmoil. The brutal murder of a child as innocent as a 2-year-old had shaken the community, evoking tears and profound anger. The sentiment was so intense that it practically condemned the perpetrators to a life in hiding if they ever ventured into the public sphere. Yet, these culprits were merely children of 10, making any sentencing decision the subject of heated controversy. There was a significant divide in public opinion regarding the appropriate punishment for John Venables and Robert Thompson. While some called for the death penalty, others believed that a regular prison sentence would suffice. The debate also centered around the issue of anonymity. Why should these boys be shielded from public exposure when other murderers were not afforded the same privilege? Revealing their real names would effectively have been a death sentence, erasing all the efforts invested in their psychological rehabilitation. However, some may argue that if they didn't afford James a chance to live, why should they be allowed to live freely? When the trial started, the parents of the accused were moved to different parts of the country and assumed new identities following death threats. The full trial opened at Sessions House, Preston, on 1 November 1993, conducted as an adult trial with the accused in the dock away from their parents, and the judge and court officials in legal regalia. The boys denied the charges of murder, abduction, and attempted abduction. James's mother, devastated by the loss of her son, could only muster the strength to attend the day of the verdict. It wasn't until the sentencing that the judge permitted the media to publish the faces of Robert and John, who had shown no remorse throughout the 17-day trial. The evidence presented indicated that both boys understood the difference between right and wrong. John's tears seemed to stem from the anticipation of their impending fate, while Robert remained emotionally detached. With this knowledge in mind, on November 24, 1993, John Venables and Robert Thompson, initially facing a minimum of 15 years in prison, received a different sentence. They were to be held in a juvenile detention center until they turned 18, avoiding a real prison experience. This decision disappointed the public to the extent that riots erupted and vehicles believed to be carrying the boys were vandalized. However, these vehicles were decoys, and the boys were transported discreetly in other vehicles. From that point onward, they were granted new identities, shrouded in secrecy, known only to the authorities tasked with monitoring their lives. Initially, public outrage soared when news broke that the government had allocated £1.5 million, roughly equivalent to $2 million, for the rehabilitation of these young boys. This sparked a moral dilemma, as many argued that this substantial sum could have been better spent on saving innocent children, providing them with essential medications and sustenance. After all, this money came from hard-working taxpayers who weren't keen on supporting these boys financially. Some demanded a minimum prison sentence of 15 years for the young offenders, and this demand held some validity. Despite the expertise of psychologists, it's well established that by the age of 18, an individual's brain hasn't fully matured and latent issues may surface. Allowing potentially dangerous individuals to exit psychological support at this age was seen as a considerable risk. In June 2001, both boys were released, and their anonymity would only be lifted if they committed another crime. Interestingly, Robert, who initially appeared more problematic, managed to stay clear of criminal activity. On the contrary, John's behavior took a different turn, becoming a focal point for those questioning the efficacy of the system and how such individuals could be allowed to reintegrate into society. John's criminal history began with a brief jail sentence in 2008 for instigating a bar brawl and being found in possession of drugs. In 2010, he faced arrest for possessing indecent images related to child abuse. Subsequently, he was convicted and sentenced to 2 years in prison after confessing to downloading and disseminating such content online. Although he was released in 2013, he returned to jail in 2017 on the same charges. This time, he received a 40-month prison term after admitting to possessing over 1,000 explicit images. The exact details of his release and subsequent actions remain unclear, as authorities, seemingly regardless of his actions, continue to shield him from public scrutiny. Even 2 decades after the initial crime, John managed to claim another victim, 36-year-old Scott Bradley. Scott, a family man, fell prey to false rumors that he was, in fact, Robert Thompson. Over several months, he endured relentless harassment, insults, and threats directed at his family, and most importantly, his beloved son. During one phone call, he confided in his mother, expressing his unbearable distress and a desire to end his own life. Regrettably, she didn't take his words seriously, assuming the situation would eventually subside. Tragically, on August 10, 2012, Scott Bradley's mother discovered her son's lifeless body hanging from a noose. When authorities arrived at the scene, they determined it was a case of suicide. The mother of James Bulger, along with countless others, couldn't help but wonder if this tragedy might have been averted had the true identities of the original perpetrators been revealed. In late June 2019, It was reported that British officials had considered resettling Venables in Canada, Australia, or New Zealand, due to the high costs behind protecting his anonymity. British authorities had reportedly spent £65,000 in legal fees to keep Venable's identity a secret. And that's the end of today's case. As always, I appreciate your support for my work. If you subscribe, like, and share this video, it will help me continue creating content. This was another episode of Crime Analysis Central. See you soon.